Guadalcanal, August 1942. Corporal James Mitchell crouched behind a fallen palm tree, his Springfield rifle aimed at what should have been a formidable enemy. 30 meters away, a Japanese Type 95 light tank clanked forward through the jungle undergrowth, its commander's head visible through the open hatch. Mitchell squeezed the trigger. The 30-aught-6 round punched through the tank's side armor with a metallic ping that echoed across the clearing. Inside, someone screamed. Mitchell's squad mates stared in disbelief. Then someone laughed, a sound mixing shock and dark humor. They had just discovered that Japanese armor could be penetrated by standard rifle fire. This single moment encapsulated a truth that would reshape Pacific War tactics and shatter Japanese confidence in their armored capabilities. The Type 95 Hago tank, pride of Imperial Japanese Army mechanized units, had armor plating so thin that determined infantrymen with basic weapons could destroy it without specialized anti-tank equipment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mathematics of armor thickness tell the story with brutal clarity. The Type 95 featured 12 millimeters of steel plating on its front armor, 6 millimeters on the sides, and as little as 4 millimeters protecting the rear and top surfaces. By comparison, American Stuart light tanks carried armor ranging from 25 to 44 millimeters thick. German Panzer III tanks operating in North Africa featured 30 millimeters of frontal armor at minimum, with later models carrying 50 millimeters or more. Even the Soviet 26 light tank, designed in the early 1930s, carried 15 millimeters of armor as a baseline. Japanese engineers had created a tank that could be defeated by weapons never intended, and for anti-armor use. This was not a minor design flaw. This was a fundamental misunderstanding of modern armored warfare. The Type 95 entered service in 1935, designed specifically for operations in China and Manchuria. Japanese military doctrine in the mid-1930s anticipated fighting Chinese forces equipped with minimal anti-tank weapons and virtually no armor of their own. The tank's design prioritized speed, reliability, and the ability to support infantry advances across difficult terrain. Weight limitations dominated every design decision. Japan's industrial capacity could not produce the heavy armor plate that American and German factories manufactured routinely. Japanese railroads featured lighter construction than European or American rail systems, limiting the weight of vehicles that could be transported efficiently. Bridges in China and Manchuria could not support heavy vehicles. Ships bringing equipment to Pacific Islands had weight restrictions. Every factor pushed Japanese designers toward lighter armor, faster vehicles, and acceptance of vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic when fighting enemies with modern weapons. Private First Class Robert Henderson encountered his first Japanese tank on Guadalcanal during the Battle of the Tenarú River on August 21, 1942. His battalion had established defensive positions expecting Japanese infantry assault. Instead, at 0200 hours, they heard mechanical rumbling. 3 Type 95 tanks emerged from the jungle, supporting Colonel Ichiki's doomed banzai charge. Henderson and his squad had no anti-tank weapons. They possessed only rifles, grenades, and a single Browning automatic rifle. Standard doctrine would call for retreat or finding cover until specialized anti-tank units arrived. Henderson's squad did neither. They opened fire with everything they had. The results shocked everyone involved. Rifle bullets sparked against the thin armor, and some penetrated completely. The BAR gunner fired sustained bursts that chewed through the tank's side plating like it was tin foil. Grenades wedged into track assemblies immobilized one vehicle. Marines swarmed the disabled tank, pried open hatches, and dropped grenades inside. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. All 3 Japanese tanks were destroyed without Marines employing a single anti-tank weapon designed for that purpose. The psychological impact of this discovery rippled through Marine units across Guadalcanal. Soldiers trained to fear tanks as nearly invincible weapons requiring specialized equipment to defeat suddenly realized Japanese armor was vulnerable to ordinary infantry weapons. This knowledge transformed tactics immediately. Rather than calling for support when tanks appeared, Marine squads engaged them directly. Rifle squads learned to target vision ports, the commander's cupola, track assemblies, and engine grills. Bar gunners discovered that sustained fire against side armor would eventually penetrate, killing crew members or igniting ammunition. The Type 95 had become a liability to Japanese forces rather than an asset. Japanese tank commanders recognized their vulnerability within days of landing on Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura commanded a platoon of 4 Type 95 tanks attached to the Sendai Division. His after-action report, captured when Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal in February 1943, detailed the impossible situation. American infantry engage our tanks without fear. They have learned our armor provides insufficient protection. Rifle fire wounds crew members even when not penetrating completely, as spalling creates shrapnel inside the crew compartment. Machine gun fire forces commanders to close hatches, eliminating visibility. Once buttoned up, we are blind, and the Americans exploit this by approaching from angles our limited gun traverse cannot cover. We have suffered 60% losses in 3 weeks, mostly from infantry weapons rather than anti-tank guns. Nakamura's platoon was destroyed completely by September 19th. He died when Marines used pole charges, explosives attached to long poles, to breach his tank's thin top armor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The technical specifications of the Type 95 reveal why Marine rifles could penetrate its armor so easily. A standard 30-aught-six rifle cartridge fired from a Springfield or M1 Garand possessed muzzle velocity of approximately 2,800 feet per second. At close range, this produced kinetic energy sufficient to penetrate 8 to 10 millimeters of steel plating if the angle of impact was favorable. The Type 95's side armor measured only 6 millimeters. Simple physics meant that perpendicular hits from rifles would punch through reliably. Angled shots might deflect, but any Marine squad engaging a tank would fire multiple rounds from multiple positions. Statistical probability guaranteed penetrations. The 50 caliber Browning machine gun, common in Marine defensive positions, devastated Japanese tanks. The armor-piercing ammunition fired by these weapons could penetrate 12 millimeters of steel at 500 yards. Every surface of the Type 95 was vulnerable. Marine machine gunners learned to engage tanks at ranges beyond the effective reach of the tank's 37mm main gun, methodically perforating the armor until crew casualties or mechanical damage forced abandonment. Staff Sergeant William Morrison recorded in his diary after the Battle of Bloody Ridge. We killed 2 Japanese tanks today using only the 50 cal. Didn't need bazookas or anything special. Just aimed for the same spot on the side armor and kept firing. After maybe 60 rounds, the tank stopped moving. Smoke came out the hatches. Crew tried to bail out, but we shot them too. The tank just sat there burning. Makes you wonder why they even bother with armor that thin. Japanese armored doctrine compounded the vulnerability created by thin armor. Type 95 tanks typically operated in close support of infantry, advancing together through jungle terrain or across open ground. This placed tanks within optimal range for Marine infantry weapons. American doctrine emphasized combined arms operations with tanks supporting infantry from positions protected by covering fire and tactical spacing. Japanese tanks advanced in close formation, presenting multiple targets simultaneously. When one tank was hit, others often stopped to assess the situation, creating static targets. Marine squads learned to focus fire on lead vehicles, blocking narrow jungle paths and preventing remaining tanks from advancing or retreating. The disabled tanks became obstacles for their own side. The Type 95's crew layout increased casualties when armor was penetrated. The 3-man crew sat in extremely close quarters. The driver occupied the front left position, the gunner sat front right, and the commander stood in a small turret behind them, serving as both tank commander and loader for the main gun. When armor-piercing rounds penetrated the crew compartment, all 3 men were in the path of spalling, the fragments of metal torn from the inside surface of armor plate by bullet impacts. These fragments acted like shrapnel, wounding or killing crew members, even when bullets themselves did not pass completely through the armor. Captured Japanese tankers described the experience as being trapped inside a metal box while someone outside pounded it with hammers that occasionally broke through to strike the occupants. Medical records from Marine aid stations on Guadalcanal document unusual wounds that confirmed armor penetration. Several Marines treated for Marine aid shrapnel injuries during tank engagements showed wounds caused by fragments of Japanese armor plating, mixed with copper jacket material from rifle bullets. The bullets had struck with sufficient force to tear pieces from the tank's interior surface, sending those pieces back outward along with bullet fragments. These wounds proved that standard rifle ammunition was not just scratching Japanese tank armor, but actually defeating it in ways that created lethal effects inside the crew compartment. The 37mm main gun mounted on the Type 95 provided insufficient firepower to compensate for armor deficiencies. This weapon fired a shell weighing 1.4 pounds with muzzle velocity of 2,300 feet per second. Against infantry in the open, it was effective. Against fortified positions or enemy armor, it was inadequate. The gun's maximum penetration against vertical armor at 100 meters was approximately 25 millimeters. American Stuart light tanks, with armor up to 44 millimeters thick at optimal angles, were largely immune to the Type 95's main gun, except at point-blank range with perfect shot placement. Japanese tankers discovered they could not penetrate American tanks reliably, while American tanks could destroy Japanese armor with every hit. This imbalance meant that tank versus tank combat resulted in predictable Japanese losses. The Battle of the Matanikau River in September 1942 demonstrated the Type 95's vulnerability in conventional armored engagement. 9 Japanese tanks attempted to force a river crossing defended by Marine positions, supported by 3 Stuart light tanks. The engagement lasted 18 minutes. All 9 Japanese tanks were destroyed. 8 fell to the Stuarts, which engaged from hull-down positions at ranges exceeding 500 meters. The Japanese tanks could not effectively return fire at that distance, and their thin armor provided no protection against the Stuart's 37mm gun-firing armor-piercing rounds. The 9th Japanese tank reached the riverbank before Marines destroyed it using rifle grenades, weapons intended primarily for anti-personnel use but effective against inadequate armor. Lieutenant Robert Blake commanded one of the Stuarts during this engagement. His after-action report captured the one-sided nature of the battle. Japanese tanks advanced in column formation along the riverbank road. We engaged at 600 yards. First round hit the lead tank center mass. Penetration was complete. The tank exploded, likely ammunition cooking off. We shifted fire to the second tank. Same result. The Japanese tanks attempted to maneuver, but their turret traverse was too slow to track us effectively. We systematically engaged each vehicle. None of our tanks were hit. The Japanese gun simply lacked the range and power to threaten us at that distance. It was target practice with live ammunition. The only danger came from Japanese infantry with magnetic mines, but our supporting Marines kept them suppressed. Marines developed improvised tactics specifically for destroying Japanese tanks without anti-tank weapons. Molotov cocktails, gasoline-filled bottles with ignited rags stuffed in the neck became standard equipment for defensive positions expected to face armor. The Type 95's thin top armor and engine deck plating offered minimal protection against fire. A Molotov cocktail landing on the engine grill would pour burning gasoline directly onto the power plant, often causing fires that spread to ammunition storage or forced crew evacuation. Satchel charges, canvas bags filled with multiple grenades or blocks of TNT, could be thrown onto tanks or placed by Marines who approached under covering fire. The explosives would detonate against the thin upper armor, penetrating easily and killing the crew. The most brazen anti-tank tactic emerged during the Battle of Edson's Ridge in September 1942. Private First Class Anthony Casamento, later awarded the Medal of Honor for actions during this battle, single-handedly disabled a Type 95 by climbing onto it while it was moving, opening the commander's hatch and dropping grenades inside. The tank's thin armor and slow speed made such desperate actions feasible in ways impossible against better protected vehicles. Casamento survived despite wounds from Japanese infantry attempting to protect their tank. The tank's crew did not. This incident spread rapidly through Marine units, establishing that Japanese tanks could be destroyed through direct assault by determined individual soldiers. Japanese tankers understood their predicament with growing desperation. Captured documents from Guadalcanal included training bulletins distributed to replacement tank crews in late 1942. These documents acknowledged that the Type 95 could not survive against American forces employing combined arms tactics. The bulletins instructed crews to avoid engagement with American armor at all costs, to operate only under cover of darkness or heavy jungle, and to withdraw immediately if engaged by weapons heavier than rifles. This guidance effectively admitted that Japanese tanks could not function in their designed role. They had become reconnaissance vehicles at best, death traps at worst. The industrial limitations that created the Type 95's thin armor reflected Japan's broader strategic weaknesses. American factories in 1942 produced steel armor plate in quantities measured in tens of thousands of tons monthly. Japanese production measured in hundreds of tons. The steel quality also differed. American armor used nickel-chrome alloys that provided superior hardness and resistance to penetration. Japanese armor used lower-grade steel with minimal alloying elements, trading protection for manufacturability. Even if Japanese designers had specified thicker armor, production facilities could not have manufactured it in required quantities. The Type 95 represented the maximum capability of Japanese heavy industry applied to armored vehicle production, and that maximum fell far short of adequacy. The logistical chain supporting Japanese armored units compounded problems created by inadequate armor protection. Replacement tanks arrived slowly, and in small numbers. Spare parts were scarce. Ammunition supplies ran low within weeks of sustained combat. By contrast, American forces received continuous resupply by sea and air. When Stuart tanks were damaged, repair units fixed them rapidly, or replaced them entirely with new vehicles shipped from the United States. Japanese tanks that broke down often could not be repaired and had to be abandoned. High casualty rates among tank crews meant that replacement crews had minimal training, further degrading effectiveness. The Type 95 began the war as an inadequate design and deteriorated into obsolescence within months, as American forces learned its vulnerabilities, and Japanese industry failed to provide either improvements or sufficient replacements. The human cost of fighting in tanks penetrable by rifle fire traumatized Japanese armored crews. Unlike infantry who could take cover, disperse under fire, or surrender if situations became hopeless, tankers were trapped in metal boxes that offered no real protection. When Marines concentrated fire on a tank, the crew had only two choices: remain inside and face almost certain death from penetrating rounds or ammunition fires, or attempt to evacuate and face immediate death from Marines who killed escaping crew members on sight. Survival rates for Japanese tankers on Guadalcanal fell below 20%. This compared to infantry casualties averaging 40% in the same battles. Being a tanker in the Imperial Japanese Army became effectively a death sentence. The psychological warfare value of vulnerable Japanese armor extended far beyond simple combat effectiveness. When Marines discovered they could destroy tanks with rifles, a fundamental shift occurred in how they perceived Japanese military capability. Private Daniel Kozlowski wrote to his family in October 1942, describing an encounter that captured this transformation perfectly. "We saw 3 Jap tanks coming through the trees and nobody panicked. Sergeant just told us to aim for the sides and keep firing. We put about 200 rounds into those tanks in maybe 5 minutes. All 3 stopped moving. Crew tried to get out, but we shot them too. It wasn't even scary. It was just work. After that, whenever someone said Jap tanks were coming, guys would actually get excited because it meant easier targets than infantry and bunkers. That's how bad their armor is. We're more afraid of their machine gun nests than their tanks." This reversal of traditional military hierarchy, where armored vehicles represented the pinnacle of ground combat power, devastated Japanese morale across the Pacific theater. Tank units that should have been elite formations inspiring confidence instead became symbols of Japanese industrial inadequacy. Infantry commanders stopped requesting tank support because the presence of Type 95s drew concentrated American fire without providing meaningful offensive capability. Tankers who survived early battles often requested transfer to infantry units, preferring the risks of fighting without armor to the certainty of death inside penetrable steel boxes. The Type 95 had become worse than useless. It was actively harmful to Japanese combat effectiveness and morale. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 showcased how thoroughly Marines had integrated anti-tank tactics into standard infantry operations. Japanese defenders positioned 14 Type 95 tanks in prepared emplacements across Batio Island, using them as stationary pillboxes rather than mobile weapons. This defensive use acknowledged the tank's failure in its designed role. Marine commanders planned for these positions as they would any fortified bunker, assigning demolition teams and flamethrower units to reduce them systematically. The Marine assault encountered 7 tanks on the first day. All 7 were destroyed within hours using satchel charges, flamethrowers, and in 2 cases, direct rifle fire through vision ports that killed commanders and forced crew evacuation. The remaining 7 tanks fell over the next 2 days. Not a single Marine casualty was attributed to Japanese tank main gunfire during the entire battle. The tank's machine guns killed some Marines, but those same casualties would have occurred if the positions had been conventional bunkers without the additional vulnerability that armor penetration created. Japanese military leadership recognized the Type 95's obsolescence by mid-1943, but lacked resources to replace it with better designs. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank featured slightly better armor, 15 mm on the front and 20 mm on the turret, but this remained inadequate against American weapons. More critically, Japan's production capacity could not manufacture medium tanks in quantities sufficient to replace light tanks being destroyed in the Pacific. The Type 95 remained in frontline service not because it was adequate, but because nothing else existed in sufficient numbers. This trapped Japanese armored units in a death spiral where ineffective tanks were lost faster than factories could replace them with equally ineffective replacements. The technical analysis of why rifle bullets penetrated Japanese tank armor reveals fundamental misunderstandings in Japanese armored doctrine. Armor protection follows principles of metallurgy and physics that were well understood by 1935, when the Type 95 entered service. German, Soviet, American, and British designers all recognized that light tanks required minimum 12 to 15 mm armor to resist heavy machine gun fire with frontal armor of 20 to 25 mm to provide protection against small-caliber anti-tank weapons. Japanese designers either did not understand these requirements or consciously chose to ignore them in favor of weight reduction. Either explanation reveals critical failures in military engineering judgment. The doctrine of speed over protection that guided Type 95 design assumed that rapid movement would prevent enemies from targeting tanks effectively. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong in Pacific combat conditions. Jungle terrain restricted movement to narrow paths where tanks could not maneuver evasively. Coral atolls offered no concealment and limited routes of advance. Even on larger islands like Guadalcanal and Saipan, thick vegetation channeled tanks into predictable approach routes that Marines covered with overlapping fields of fire. The speed advantage that supposedly compensated for thin armor became meaningless when terrain negated mobility. Japanese tanks could not outrun bullets in environments where movement was constrained to walking pace through difficult ground. Corporal James Mitchell participated in the Battle of Cape Gloucester in December 1943, where his squad encountered 4 Type 95 tanks attempting to support a Japanese counterattack. His account illustrates how completely Marines had adapted to fighting Japanese armor. "We heard the tanks coming through the jungle about 200 yards out. Lieutenant didn't even call for anti-tank support. He just positioned us where we had good sight lines and told us to wait. The tanks came through single file because that's the only way they could move in that terrain. We let the first one pass our position, then opened up on the second tank from both sides simultaneously. Probably 30 guys firing rifles and BARs into it at the same time from maybe 50 feet away. The tank stopped within seconds. Smoke started coming out, The other tanks tried to reverse but got stuck in the mud. We destroyed all 4 in about 10 minutes. Used maybe 1,000 rounds of rifle ammunition total. No grenades, no special weapons, just standard infantry loads. That's all it took. The mathematical certainty of Type 95 vulnerability created predictable tactical outcomes that Japanese commanders could not overcome through clever strategy or brave sacrifice. When Marines established defensive positions, they placed automatic weapons to cover likely tank approach routes. When Japanese tanks appeared, Marines engaged with concentrated fire that penetrated armor through sheer volume, even if individual shots were ineffective. The tanks would stop, either from mechanical damage, crew casualties, or crew panic. Stopped tanks became stationary, targets for more precise fire or demolition teams. Within minutes, the tanks were destroyed or abandoned. This sequence repeated so consistently that Marine units developed standard operating procedures, treating Japanese tank encounters as routine rather than exceptional events. The Type 95's crew suffered psychological trauma from operating vehicles that provided illusory rather than actual protection. Tankers understood intellectually that their armor was inadequate, but human psychology creates false security from being enclosed in metal, even when that enclosure is penetrable. The first time bullets punched through armor, killing or wounding crew members, survivors experienced profound shock. They had trusted the tank to protect them, and that trust was revealed as unfounded. Subsequent operations occurred with the knowledge that armor might as well not exist, that they were driving around in metal coffins that attracted rather than deflected enemy fire. This knowledge destroyed unit cohesion and combat effectiveness in ways that went beyond simple fear. Private First Class Kenji Matsuda, captured on Saipan in July 1944 after his tank was disabled by rifle fire, described the experience to American interrogators with brutal honesty. "After my first battle, I knew I would die. Our tank was hit by machine gun fire that wounded our gunner and damaged the main gun. We retreated and made repairs, but I understood that the next battle would kill us. Every tanker knew this. We were not warriors in that tank. We were corpses who had not yet stopped breathing. The Americans could kill us whenever they wanted with whatever weapons they had. Our armor was just metal that trapped us and made us easier to kill than if we fought as infantry. I surrendered as soon as my tank was hit because I decided I would rather live as a prisoner than die pointlessly in a vehicle that existed only to get us killed." The industrial capacity difference between Japan and America manifested most clearly in armor quality and quantity. American factories in 1943 produced approximately 30,000 tanks of all types. Japanese production in the same year totaled approximately 600 armored vehicles, including tankettes and self-propelled guns. This 50-to-1 production ratio meant that even if Japanese tanks had matched American quality, which they did not, the sheer numerical disparity would have guaranteed defeat in any sustained armored campaign. The Type 95's inadequacy magnified this disparity. American tanks could engage Japanese armor with confidence of victory, while Japanese tanks avoided combat with American armor out of certainty of destruction. Asymmetric warfare cannot succeed when the asymmetry favors the enemy in every measurable dimension. The Battle of Kwajalein in February 1944 demonstrated the complete irrelevance of Japanese armor against prepared Marine assaults. Defenders positioned 8 Type 95 tanks in fortified positions across the atoll. Marine pre-invasion bombardment destroyed 3 tanks before infantry even landed, naval gunfire collapsing the revetments and crushing the thin-armored vehicles. Of the remaining 5 tanks, 4 were destroyed by Marine engineers using demolitions before the tanks could engage any targets. The 5th tank fired 3 rounds from its main gun before a Marine bazooka team destroyed it with a single rocket. The entire contribution of Japanese armor to the defense amounted to 3 ineffective cannon shots and scattered machine gun fire that killed no Marines. This represented the complete failure of an entire class of military equipment to perform any useful function. Japanese tactical adjustments to Type 95 vulnerability included increasingly desperate measures that acknowledged the tank's obsolescence. Commanders ordered tanks to operate only at night, hoping darkness would prevent accurate Marine fire. This failed because American forces used illumination rounds and had superior night vision equipment. Tanks were buried in prepared positions with only turrets exposed, converting them to stationary pillboxes. This negated their mobility advantage entirely and made them vulnerable to precision fire from tank destroyers and field artillery. Some tanks were stripped of main guns and converted to supply vehicles or command posts, roles that did not require armor protection but still suffered from the vehicle's vulnerability to interdiction fire. Every adaptation represented retreat from the concept of tanks as offensive weapons. The human stories of Japanese tankers reveal the tragedy of soldiers sent to fight in equipment their own military knew was inadequate. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada commanded a tank platoon on Peleliu in September 1944. His diary, recovered after his death, documented the psychological deterioration of his unit over 3 weeks of combat. The first entry expressed confidence that his tanks would stop the American landing. The second entry, written after the first day of battle, recorded the destruction of 2 of his 4 tanks by Marine rifle grenades and the severe wounding of both crews. The third entry described his remaining 2 tanks hiding in caves during daylight hours, emerging only after dark to move between positions. The fourth entry acknowledged that his tanks could not fight effectively and were awaiting destruction. The final entry, written hours before Yamada died when Marines sealed his tank in a cave with demolitions, contained only one sentence: "We were sent here to die in vehicles that cannot protect us and cannot harm the enemy. This is how the Empire values our lives." The comparative analysis of armor penetration reveals the scale of Japanese design failure. A 30-aught-6 rifle bullet at 100 meters delivered approximately 2,600 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. The Type 95 6mm side armor required approximately 1,500 foot-pounds to penetrate under optimal conditions. This left 1,000 foot-pounds of energy margin, meaning that even degraded performance from longer ranges or poor angles would still often achieve penetration. By contrast, the Stuart tank's minimum armor of 25mm required approximately 9,000 foot-pounds to penetrate with rifle-caliber ammunition, far exceeding what infantry weapons could deliver. The engineering margin for error was 20 times greater on American tanks. This disparity meant that American tanks could absorb hits that would have destroyed Japanese vehicles multiple times over. The Battle of Guam in July 1944 included several incidents where Marines destroyed Type 95 tanks using captured Japanese weapons, illustrating that even Japan's own small arms could penetrate their armor. A Marine patrol found an abandoned Japanese heavy machine gun, the Type 92, and used it to engage 2 tanks attempting to move between defensive positions. The 7.7mm rounds from the Japanese weapon perforated both tanks, forcing crew evacuation. The Marines then destroyed the abandoned vehicles with thermite grenades. This engagement proved that Japanese tanks were vulnerable even to weapons from their own arsenal, a humiliation that Japanese military leadership could not explain or remedy. The final campaigns of the Pacific War saw Japanese armor deployed with complete acknowledgement of its worthlessness in combat roles. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, 23 Type 95 tanks were buried in defensive positions or hidden in caves, used exclusively as stationary weapon platforms rather than mobile fighting vehicles. Marine after-action reports noted that Japanese tanks on Iwo Jima posed less threat than conventional bunkers because the tank's armor channeled explosive force inward when hit by rockets or demolitions, killing crews instantly, while concrete bunkers required sustained assault to reduce. The tank's presence actually simplified Marine operations by providing easily identifiable targets for anti-tank weapons that destroyed them more quickly than purely infantry positions could be cleared. The psychological burden carried by Japanese tankers manifested in surrender rates higher than those of infantry units, unprecedented in an army indoctrinated against surrender under any circumstances. Of the approximately 300 Japanese tankers who fought on Saipan in June 1944, 47 surrendered, a 16% rate compared to less than 1% for infantry. Interrogation reports revealed consistent themes. Tankers felt betrayed by leadership that sent them to fight in inadequate equipment, They recognized that their tanks attracted fire without providing protection, and they concluded that death in a penetrable tank served no purpose when the battle's outcome was predetermined. One captured tanker told interrogators, "Infantry who die are heroes. Tankers who die are fools. We knew our tanks were worthless, but we could not refuse orders. When my tank was hit, and I survived, I decided I would not be a fool. I surrendered because dying in that vehicle would mean nothing." The legacy of the Type 95's failure extended beyond the Pacific War into post-war Japanese military development. The tank represented a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare's material requirements, a belief that fighting spirit could compensate for industrial inadequacy. When Marines laughed as they fired rifles through Japanese tank armor, they were not merely celebrating a tactical advantage. They were demonstrating the bankruptcy of military philosophy that prioritized warrior ethos over engineering reality. The lessons learned were harsh but clear. Modern warfare rewards nations that can produce superior equipment in overwhelming quantities, operated by well-trained soldiers who trust their equipment will protect them. Japan's tanks protected no one, impressed no enemies, and contributed nothing except the deaths of crews who deserved better from their leaders and their nation's industry. The laughter of Marines discovering they could destroy tanks with rifles echoed across the Pacific as the sound of one military power's humiliation by another power that understood what modern war truly required. The strategic implications of Type 95 inadequacy extended far beyond individual battles to shape the entire Pacific campaign's trajectory. Japanese military planners in Tokyo understood by late 1943 that their armored forces could not contest American landings effectively. Intelligence reports from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Makin detailed how Marines destroyed tanks with standard infantry weapons, forcing a complete reassessment of armor's role in defensive operations. Officers prepared memoranda acknowledging that Type 95 tanks could not fulfill their designed purpose against American forces. One document captured on Saipan stated bluntly, "Our light tanks are obsolete against American equipment and tactics. They cannot penetrate American armor, cannot withstand American fire, and cannot maneuver effectively under American air superiority. Continued production represents waste of resources better allocated to anti-tank guns and fortifications." This assessment never translated into policy changes because Japanese industry lacked capacity to produce alternatives in meaningful numbers. The comparative performance of Japanese and American armor doctrine revealed fundamental differences in how each nation approached mechanized warfare. American doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination, where tanks supported infantry and infantry protected tanks, with both arms mutually reinforcing under umbrella of artillery and air support. Tank crews, trained to fight as part of integrated teams, using terrain for protection, coordinating with supporting elements, and withdrawing when faced with superior opposition. Japanese doctrine treated tanks as breakthrough weapons that would smash enemy positions through shock effect, operating semi-independently from infantry with limited artillery coordination. This doctrine assumed enemies would fear tanks and break under armored assault. When Marines demonstrated they neither feared Japanese tanks nor required specialized weapons to destroy them, the entire doctrinal framework collapsed. Japanese tankers found themselves operating according to tactics designed for enemies who no longer existed, if they ever had. Private First Class Anthony Bucci encountered Japanese armor on 3 separate islands during his Pacific service, and his experiences illustrated the evolution of Marine confidence when facing Type 95s. On Guadalcanal in October 1942, his first exposure to enemy tanks prompted genuine concern until his squad sergeant demonstrated rifle penetration by putting 6 rounds through a tank's side armor at 75 yards. On Bougainville in November 1943, Bucci's squad destroyed 2 tanks using only rifle grenades and small arms fire, treating the engagement as routine. On Guam in July 1944, Bucci barely remembered the tank his platoon destroyed because it seemed unremarkable compared to reducing fortified bunkers that actually posed threats. His casual dismissal of enemy armor in later battles contrasted sharply with initial wariness, demonstrating how completely Japanese tanks had lost psychological impact. When soldiers stop considering enemy weapons dangerous, those weapons have failed at the most fundamental level. The industrial analysis of armor production reveals why Japan could not remedy Type 95 deficiencies even after recognizing them. Steel production in Japan during 1943 totaled approximately 7 million tons annually. American steel production the same year exceeded 80 million tons. This 10-to-1 advantage meant America could allocate steel to armor production while simultaneously supporting aircraft, ship, and weapons manufacturing at levels Japan could not match in any single category. Japanese factories prioritized aircraft and ship construction for naval warfare, relegating army equipment to secondary status. Tank production received minimal steel allocation, forcing continued manufacture of obsolete designs because retooling for better models would further reduce already inadequate output. The Type 95 remained in production not through choice but through industrial necessity that admitted no alternatives. The human cost of this industrial failure manifested in casualty rates that devastated Japanese tank units. Of approximately 1,200 Japanese tankers deployed to Pacific Islands between 1942 and 1945, fewer than 50 survived the war. This 96% casualty rate exceeded even infantry losses in the most savage campaigns. Tankers died not primarily in combat, but trapped in disabled vehicles that became death traps when penetrated. Medical records from field hospitals on Saipan documented horrific wounds suffered by tankers who survived initial vehicle penetration. Burns from ammunition fires ignited by tracer rounds, traumatic amputations from internal explosions when magazines cooked off, shrapnel wounds from armor spalling that filled crew compartments with supersonic metal fragments. Doctors noted that tanker casualties required more extensive treatment than comparable infantry wounds because the confined space of tank interiors concentrated explosive force and fragmentation effects. Lieutenant Harold Morrison commanded a Stuart tank platoon during the Marianas Campaign in summer 1944, engaging Japanese armor on both Saipan and Tinian. His after-action reports documented 8 separate encounters with Type 95 tanks, resulting in 13 Japanese vehicles destroyed without a single American tank loss. Morrison's tactical analysis revealed contempt barely concealed by professional military language. Enemy armor presents minimal threat to our operations. Their main guns cannot penetrate our armor at any practical engagement range. Our guns destroy them reliably with a single hit. Enemy tanks show poor tactical employment, advancing into prepared firing positions without reconnaissance or supporting fires. Crew training appears inadequate as they fail to use terrain effectively or coordinate with infantry. The only tactical value enemy tanks provide is drawing our attention briefly before destruction. Recommend treating enemy armor as priority targets of opportunity rather than threats requiring dedicated anti-tank response. This assessment, repeated across Marine tank units throughout the Pacific, codified Japanese armor's relegation to irrelevance. The psychological documentation of Japanese tanker trauma provides insight into the mental toll of fighting in equipment acknowledged as inadequate. Captain Yoshio Nakamura, medical officer attached to the 2nd Tank Regiment on Peleliu, kept detailed notes on psychiatric casualties among tank crews. His journal, recovered after the battle, described progressive mental deterioration among tankers who survived multiple engagements. After first battle exposure, crews show normal stress responses with anxiety and hypervigilance. After second engagement, where their vehicle is penetrated but they survive, symptoms escalate dramatically. Crew members refuse to enter tanks, develop tremors when mechanical sounds are heard, experience nightmares of burning alive. Several men have attempted suicide rather than return to combat in their vehicles. I have recommended that surviving crews be reassigned to infantry, but command refuses due to personnel shortages. We are sending psychologically broken men to die in machines they fear more than the enemy. Nakamura died when his aid station was overrun, but his observations documented the unique psychological burden imposed by fighting in armor that provided false protection. The tactical innovation forced upon Japanese forces by Type 95 failure included desperate improvisations that highlighted the equipment's inadequacy. On Iwo Jima, Japanese engineers modified tanks by adding concrete and sandbags to exterior surfaces, attempting to create additional protection through improvised armor. This added weight reduced already marginal mobility to near zero, effectively converting tanks into pillboxes. The added armor proved insufficient against marine weapons while eliminating the speed advantage that supposedly justified original thin armor. Other modifications included removing turrets and mounting larger anti-tank guns in fixed mounts, creating tank destroyers from chassis, designed for light tanks. These conversions acknowledged that the Type 95 could not function in its designed role and represented desperate attempts to extract some utility from obsolete equipment. Corporal Robert Hayes participated in the Battle of Peleliu, where his squad encountered a Type 95 modified with concrete armor. His account captured the tragicomic futility of Japanese attempts to remedy armor inadequacy through field modification. We came across this Jap tank that looked like someone had smeared concrete all over it, maybe 6 inches thick on the sides. It was stuck in a crater and couldn't move, probably broke down from the extra weight. We opened fire with rifles like always, and the bullets just sparked off the concrete. Then someone remembered we had a bazooka team attached to our platoon. They put one rocket into it and the whole thing went up like a bomb. Turns out the concrete didn't protect against shaped charges at all, just made the tank too heavy to move, and probably crushed the suspension. We found the crew still inside. Looked like the rocket blast killed them instantly. All that work adding armor, and it made no difference except the tank couldn't run away. The comparative analysis of tank crew training revealed another dimension of Japanese armored forces inadequacy. American tank crews underwent 6 months of specialized instruction covering gunnery, tactics, maintenance, communications, and combined arms coordination before deployment. Japanese tankers received 8 to 12 weeks of basic training focused primarily on mechanical operation and gunnery, with minimal tactical instruction. Advanced training in armor tactics existed only for officers, and even that instruction proved inadequate against American combined arms doctrine. The crew quality disparity meant that even if Japanese tanks had matched American armor protection and firepower, which they did not, American crews would still have dominated through superior training. The combination of inferior equipment and inadequate training created Japanese tank units that could not compete on any measurable dimension. The logistical nightmare of supporting Type 95 operations in the Pacific contributed significantly to their combat ineffectiveness. Tanks required fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and maintenance support that Japanese supply chains could not provide reliably to isolated island garrisons. On Guadalcanal, Japanese tanks ran out of fuel within 2 weeks of landing, forcing crews to operate vehicles sparingly and often abandoning them when local fuel supplies were exhausted. Ammunition for 37mm main guns arrived in quantities measured in dozens of rounds rather than hundreds, limiting tanks to a handful of engagements before becoming mobile machine gun platforms. Spare parts never materialized, meaning that mechanical breakdowns permanently disabled vehicles. American forces captured numerous Type 95 tanks abandoned intact because minor mechanical failures could not be repaired without parts that never arrived. The Battle of Saipan in June 1944 provided the most comprehensive demonstration of Japanese armor's complete failure against prepared marine assaults. 48 Type 95 and Type 97 tanks, the largest Japanese armored force committed to single Pacific battle, attempted to stop the marine advance in a series of desperate counterattacks between June 16th and July 9th. Marine forces destroyed all 48 tanks while suffering minimal casualties from armored fire. The largest single engagement occurred on June 24th, when 31 tanks attacked marine positions near Mount Taposhao. Marine Sherman tanks, anti-tank guns, bazookas, and infantry destroyed the entire formation in 90 minutes of combat. Not a single American tank was lost. Japanese casualties included approximately 200 tank crew members, killed and all 31 vehicles destroyed or disabled beyond recovery. This represented the death of Japanese armored capability in the Pacific and the complete vindication of every assessment declaring Type 95 obsolete. Private First Class Kenji Takahashi survived this battle as a tank driver, escaping his burning vehicle with severe wounds. His interrogation testimony provided Japanese perspective on the massacre. "We advanced in 3 columns toward American positions on the hillside. Their tanks opened fire at maybe 800 meters. Our tanks exploded before we could return fire effectively. Some tanks tried to close the distance but were hit repeatedly. My tank was struck 4 times. The first hit killed our gunner. The second penetrated the engine. The third set ammunition on fire. The fourth hit as I was evacuating and wounded me. I watched all 3 columns destroyed in perhaps 1 hour. American tanks fired from positions we could not reach while their infantry stopped any attempt to close distance. It was not battle, it was execution. Our tanks could not penetrate their armor even at close range. Their guns destroyed us from distances where we could not fight back. We were sent to die in a battle that no one could survive." The psychological impact on Marine forces of repeatedly destroying Japanese tanks with basic weapons created lasting contempt for enemy armored capabilities that influenced post-war assessment of Japanese military competence. Marines who fought in the Pacific developed conviction that Japanese equipment was universally inferior, an overgeneralization based on experiences with armor but applied to all Japanese material. This perception proved partially accurate for tanks and aircraft, but underestimated Japanese capabilities in other domains like torpedoes, night fighting tactics, and defensive fortifications. The Type 95's spectacular inadequacy colored American understanding of Japanese military capability in ways that occasionally led to underestimating threats that were actually substantial. The final deployment of Type 95 tanks on Okinawa in spring 1945 represented the absolute nadir of Japanese armored forces' effectiveness. 13 tanks remained operational when American forces landed on April 1st. Japanese commanders, having learned from previous disasters, refused to commit tanks to combat except as a last resort. The vehicles remained hidden in caves for 2 months, while conventional infantry fought desperate defensive campaign. On June 4th, with Japanese lines collapsing, commanders ordered the surviving tanks into a final counterattack. Marine and Army forces destroyed all 13 vehicles within 3 hours, most before they traveled more than 500 meters from starting positions. American casualties from this armored attack totaled 0. The tank's only accomplishment was briefly drawing fire that might otherwise have targeted infantry, a role that did not require armor and represented complete abandonment of tanks' designed purpose. The metallurgical analysis conducted post-war on captured Type 95 armor revealed the technical reasons for catastrophic vulnerability. Japanese armor plate used carbon steel with minimal alloying elements, creating metal that was relatively soft and prone to spalling when struck. American armor incorporated nickel and molybdenum, creating harder, more resistant plate that deflected projectiles or resisted penetration. The manufacturing process also differed. American plate underwent heat treatment that increased hardness without sacrificing toughness. Japanese plate received minimal heat treatment due to energy costs and manufacturing time constraints. The result was armor that tested at 40 to 50% lower hardness values than comparable American plate. This metallurgical inferiority meant that even if Japanese tanks had carried thicker armor, the poor steel quality would have still left them vulnerable to weapons American tanks resisted. The economic calculation behind Type 95 production revealed decisions driven by desperation rather than sound military analysis. Each Type 95 cost approximately 75,000 yen to manufacture, roughly equivalent to $12,000 in 1940 dollars. This represented significant investment for equipment that could not perform its designed role. Japanese military budgets allocated funds to produce approximately 600 armored vehicles annually, while understanding those vehicles were obsolete before leaving factories. The economic waste was staggering. Resources spent building tanks that would be destroyed in their first engagement might have produced additional artillery, anti-tank guns, or fortifications that would have served defensive needs more effectively. The continued production of Type 95 tanks into 1945 represented institutional failure to adapt doctrine and procurement to battlefield reality. The human stories of final tank crews reveal the tragedy of soldiers abandoned by their nation's industrial and military leadership. Lieutenant Saburo Kojima commanded the last operational Type 95 on Okinawa, hidden in a cave system near Shuri Castle. His diary documented 3 months of waiting while American forces ground through Japanese defenses overhead. The entries evolved from determination to resignation to despair. The final entry, written on June 3rd, the night before his ordered attack, contained remarkable clarity about his situation. "Tomorrow we attack. Command says our tanks will break through American lines. Command lies. Our tanks cannot break anything. American rifles pierce our armor. Their bazookas destroy us with single shots. Their Sherman tanks kill us before we can approach effective range. We will die tomorrow and accomplish nothing. But we are soldiers. We have orders. We will attack knowing we will die. Knowing our deaths serve no purpose. Knowing our leaders sent us to battle in vehicles that cannot protect us and cannot harm the enemy. This is how the Empire values our service. This is how the war ends, with brave men dying in worthless machines because no one will speak truth to power." Kojima died when his tank was hit by 3 bazooka rounds simultaneously, destroying the vehicle and killing the entire crew before they fired a single shot at enemy forces. The legacy of Type 95 failure teaches lessons that extend beyond historical interest into fundamental truths about military preparedness and honest assessment of capabilities. Nations that send soldiers to fight with inadequate equipment betray those soldiers more profoundly than enemies ever could. Japanese tankers trusted their vehicles to provide protection, trusted their leaders to provide adequate equipment, trusted their nation's industry to supply tools equal to the mission demanded. All that trust was betrayed. The laughter of Marines discovering they could penetrate Japanese tank armor with rifles represented more than tactical advantage. It represented the sound of one nation's honest industrial capacity, defeating another nation's self-deception about its capabilities. Modern military forces must remember this lesson. Equipment inadequacy cannot be overcome through courage, training, or fighting spirit alone. Soldiers deserve equipment that will protect them and enable mission accomplishment. Anything less is betrayal, and that betrayal will be paid in lives that could have been saved through honest assessment and adequate preparation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.